Hello everyone and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 12 years now, and I sit within our Knowledge and Practice Directorate looking at really the whole impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members working worldwide, right across that property life cycle through land, planning and development, construction, valuation, finance, brokerage, property management, building surveying. It's a huge canvas upon which data and technology is having a profound effect. And indeed, our members work across all the major asset types, whether that's land itself, residential, commercial, alternative assets and infrastructure. So once again, a hugely broad church in the way that data and tech is revolutionizing the way the sector can operate. And I'm really glad to have IRT Surveys back again, and we've had a number of conversations before, Stewart, but great to have you and Lisa on the call. And perhaps if I can begin with you, Stewart, and a bit of a kind of a backstory with you and a backstory to IRT for those of our viewers who've not seen us chat before.
Well, maybe they're very lucky that they haven't heard my ramblings before, and maybe that's a good thing. But thank you very much for having us back. It's nice to be back with RICS. So yeah, IRT. My background was 5 years in architecture, and then 3 years in sales, and then 5 years in specification sales with a roof company called Bowder, selling flat roofs and roof gardens. Then I set IRT up 22 years ago, believe it or not. Oh. I know I don't look old enough to have been it 22 years with that extensive career, but 22 years ago, set up IRT basically to give RICS members open and honest, transparent, visual evidence of building defects. And the company's kind of grown, got more and more into software and energy as the business evolved. And last year we sold the company to the Mears Group PLC.
Great. And Lisa, what's your background?
Right. So well, I've been with IRT now for nearly 2 years, I think. So my background is I was working in data monitoring for a number of years, focused on energy efficiency, monitoring like the performance of like renewable energy systems. So my background is business development, business improvement, but within the areas of software and data.
Fascinating. Well, I know, Stewart, that a lot of the conversations we've had in the past have very much focused, understandably, I think, on the challenges around residential property in terms of retrofit and thermal performance. But I think today it'd be great to kind of perhaps have a similar kind of conversation around the commercial sector. And I guess the first thing I'd like to kind of pitch to you as a challenge is your view of the complexity of modelling for that commercial sector as opposed to residential.
It's definitely harder. Andrew, just in terms of the sheer number of uses and archetypes, you know, there are only X amount of types of houses, you know, bungalows, semi-detached, two-story villas, flats. It's a fairly finite amount of houses with limited variation. And even size, even a big house compared to a small house, it's not that different compared to, say, a shopping centre to an office, to a swimming pool, to a university complex. So it's the sheer amount of variables that cause complexity, and even the tenure and lease events and things, they're all very, very complicated factors that have to be taken on board to create some kind of pragmatic retrofit solution. It's just much harder.
And what are I suppose in some respects, but people are obviously very focused now on this concept of net zero and you know, getting those emissions down. But I guess it's subtly important perhaps to sometimes tease out the difference between the CO2, the emissions side, and also the energy reduction. How do you kind of describe that as a challenge to look at both in some respects at the same time, but also differentiating what those different challenges are around energy cost and emissions?
Well, that's a really, really good question, Andrew, and it's something that's evolved over time as well, because carbon emissions and climate change and climate emergencies and global warming, that's just evolved over time as well to make it sound scarier and scarier and become more and more terrifying for us. But most of our clients, the CO2 savings have always been a nice to have. Monetary savings have always been much more important. And I think that we've seen that evolve with the focus on ESG of late, where the people at the top, the money men, are looking to buy property portfolios and investment portfolios that do have that energy and sustainability governance built into them. So that it starts with the money side of it and tracks all the way through. So carbon is every bit as much important as monetary savings these days. Whereas I think if you went back just 10 years, people hadn't really heard of ESG. It wasn't really a thing. Well, it's certainly not on the, I mean, it's on the tip of everyone's tongue today. It wasn't 10 years ago.
And you've touched on, begun to touch on some of the kind of drivers in the commercial sector, because I always see that you've got drivers pushing in different directions. You've obviously got the MEES, the sort of legislation piece, but there's also other kind of market factors. What do you think's driving? What are those multiple factors that are driving this agenda in a good way?
Have you ever seen the film Vanilla Sky, Andrew?
No.
It's a pretty bad Tom Cruise film called Vanilla Sky, and in that, his mentor says to him, the answer to 99% of questions is money. And if you track back why people are doing retrofits now as opposed to 10 years ago, it generally equates to money. And what we're seeing, I was talking to a client just last week who's about to spend £125 million retrofitting a building to get it up to scratch, because it's a 7,000 square metre building and he can get £15 more per square foot if it's energy efficient. His driver has nothing to do with CO2. His driver is purely economic. And that ultimately, when you're doing a retrofit, at some point there is an accountant sitting there saying, yes, you can spend it, or no, you can't. And it's a seesaw, it's got to balance. The scales have to balance to trigger it.
Yeah, so I suppose, as you say, but when you particularly look at commercial real estate, it's an income-producing asset, and though so it's always going to be viewed through that particular lens. And whilst hopefully there are, occupiers and asset managers pushing this agenda from perhaps a more altruistic perspective, ultimately this is also about showing a return on investment by investing in an asset and improving it. I'm moving to you, Lisa. I mean, obviously this is a data and technology conversation, and I guess I'm interested to hear your perspective around that need for more data and analytics. And I know Stewart and I, we've talked about the kind of things that you're doing in residential, but what kind of data and what kind of analytics do we need and is available now for the commercial sector?
I mean, focusing on the commercial sector, IRT have been surveying these types of buildings for like 20 years. And, we provided quite detailed, extensive reports on those properties. But now speaking to clients, now they feel they need things quantified in pounds and pence, in energy, recommendations. What do you recommend for this building? And I think what we're seeing is a lot of old historical buildings or office blocks in cities now being surveyed. And possibly because they've been left empty as well, they're maybe in a bit of a poor state. So we are focused on that sector for that very use, but that backing it up with the data and the recommendations has definitely been requested in the last kind of 6 months. How do we retrofit this? What would be the effect on our CO2? How do we tick the box for ESG, as Stewart mentioned? What is the energy savings of us installing this? How much will it cost? Is it worth it? Should we move buildings? That all those questions are going round and round and round. And speaking to a couple of the larger property consultants, they say the problem is no one really wants to make the decision on how to retrofit commercial buildings. There's much more technology on the domestic side of how we retrofit those, but the commercial buildings, they're just a lot trickier.
Indeed. And are you seeing sort of surveys being done of commercial property where there's much more enhancement in terms of the kind of things you're looking at now, because perhaps people have been looking at it perhaps a bit one-dimensionally, and now there's a lot more people are looking at, in the same way you've done thermal performance for residential? Is there that drive now to do more measurement, more kind of inspection of commercial properties?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely getting asked to back up more with data. And it is, again, around, the CO2, energy savings, heat demand data, all of that is now getting asked for in commercial surveys. And I think that's the challenge at the moment, isn't it? It's like you can survey a building and you can see the defects, but it's like, how do you fix them?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point, isn't it? That the first thing you need to do is probably fix some of the defects before you do the retrofit. One thing I know, I've had lots of conversations around some of the work I've done in the residential context, is this importance of looking at performance post the retrofit, because it's one thing to do the work, do the survey beforehand, recommend the fabric and the other changes to the heating systems, but what's your view of that importance of testing once you've done the retrofit, coming back to that property and then reviewing actually, well, on an ongoing basis, how are we performing?
I mean, we do a lot of that in the social housing sector. So all of our stock condition surveys are before and after retrofit, and they are really beneficial for just checking the work's been carried out correctly. I mean, that's the beauty of a thermal survey. Can't hide from it. So yeah, we're asked a lot on the before and after. Commercial surveys, I think it's always on the agenda, but we do a lot of before at the moment. And as you're following up to see if they've actually installed any measures or they've made any changes to buildings, it's a lot slower. So it's more on the domestic side. Would you say, Stuart?
Yeah, I've been pushing, trying to get like a building MOT off the ground for a long time, Andrew. And I've said to people, if you owned a £500 car, every year you would get it MOT'd, and you'd have to put things right. But if you own a £100 million supermarket, you don't bother. But to answer that first question as well, to add to Lisa's answer, the data quality that's out there is pretty poor. You know, we've got templates where a client can phone me and say, look, I own a 1976 school in Essex. We've got a model where we can drop a template into Essex, pick up the weather for the last 20 years in Essex. We can pick up the building regulations from 1976, and we can use a school template, and you can stretch the template and say, look, everything stays ratiometric. So you're not just stretching a template that's dumb from 4,000 square meters to 10,000. The ratio of classroom to corridors to bathrooms to offices to windows to roof all stay sensible. They're all linked. But we don't know if the front facade is glazed, the rear elevation is brick and block, there's an extension on it, there's a swimming pool. Those have massive impacts. But one of the key things the thermography adds to it is that the performance gap. It's one of the reasons I set IRT up. And it's because when I was in architecture specifying things, I assumed when I said double glaze this, make that out of this, make the floor out of that, put kingspan over here, put bowder on that, I assumed that's what got built. And when I was on the specification sales side of life, I realized that every man and his dog tries to change the specification and no one tells the architect. So 10 years down the line, when a building surveyor gets called to look at a defect, he arrives on site blind. And it's why you need really skilled RICS surveyors to say, that's not kingspan, that's not bowder.
Yeah.
Let's do a survey and evaluate this without prejudice and just be transparent. And things degrade. You know, people assume that because they insulated something 20 years ago, that it's still well insulated. And in our experience, we find of the 100% of buildings we survey, about 30% of them are well insulated. About 30% of them have got no insulation, and 30% of them are badly insulated. You can round that up to 33.3% in the end.
You know, it's interesting, Stuart, you mentioned that concept of an MOT, and I guess in many respects, there's lots of standards out there, but do you see almost a gap in terms of fewer standards and a more kind of consistent, coherent way of looking at retrofit?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see that in place. I mean, we're just about to go live with a vehicle we've christened Mapper. It's a Volkswagen Caddy van, but it's got 4 thermal cameras on the roof. It's got a LiDAR system on the roof, and it's got a 360-degree visual camera system, all linked to a military spec GPS. And that's going to be driving the streets, recording everything. So building real-time 3D models that are measurable, overlaid with a high-res visual, overlaid with a high-res thermal. But then we have developed and are continuing to develop AI that can automate that analysis process to say that is glass, that is granite, that's timber, that's brick, that's block, that's Georgian, that's Victorian, that's slate, that's tile. The more of that data we capture, the better quality the output and the more automated it is. Because with the best will in the world, we can drive at 30 miles an hour capturing data at a terabyte every 20 minutes, and we can put it up into the cloud. But if it's not intelligently analysed, and automated, it's worthless. And that's where we are with that. Sorry for the shameless plug, but it's quite an exciting thing to do, you know.
I think on the analysis side of things, so our biggest challenge at the moment is there's a lot of people out there buying thermal cameras and, you know, doing their own surveys.
Yeah.
And, you know, now those people are coming back to us and saying, well, what we're lacking is the analysis and the data to back that up. So yeah, as Stuart said, you can take as many pictures as you like, but if you can't actually interpret them or analyse them, then there's no benefit to it. So we're seeing a lot of that.
Yeah, indeed. Going back to you, Stuart, I'd like to ask, when I say a big question, I think a very profound question in terms of how we deal with property moving forward, particularly in this commercial sector. Is this, you know, demolition versus new build versus refit piece? Because, excuse me, we clearly have, on the one hand, potentially a large stock of buildings that are going to be quite hard to retrofit and quite expensive to retrofit. But on the other hand, if we demolish all this stuff, we have a huge amount of embodied carbon going into landfill. We then have to build, hopefully, you know, net zero buildings. So in an ideal world, we retrofit more than we demolish. But what are you seeing in the market, and how is that debate kind of playing out, particularly when you've got, dare I say, historical buildings, which by default, perhaps the building envelope is a harder thing to look at in terms of retrofit and building performance?
I think the honest answer to that, Andrew, is what I'm seeing in the marketplace is everyone asking that question. Because no one's got a decent answer to that. I was at a conference yesterday in Glasgow with Best, and there were about 800 people in the audience, and there was one chap doing a presentation where he said a house today has about I think it was 800 kilograms of CO2 associated with it, and we're trying to get it down to about 150. But to get to net zero, we have to get that down to 6.3 per square meter. But to do that, the entire supply chain has to be looked at. Where did the windows come from? Where were they painted? And they had examples of windows being manufactured, the timber coming from America, being assembled in China, being spray painted in Ukraine, and then delivered to Pilkington in France to have glass fit to them, and then delivered to site. And by the time that reaches your building site, the embodied carbon's horrific. So that whole argument of the cost benefit analysis of doing retrofit against demolition needs to be done on everything. But that event in Glasgow's actually got quite a pioneering reuse material analysis they're doing with IRT, where they're taking buildings apart by hand and they're chipping the mortar off of bricks and they're storing them for reuse. But it's about 15 times more expensive than just sending in a JCB.
Yeah. So
it's ethical and it's moral and it's the right thing to do for the planet, but it's horrifically expensive.
Yeah.
And I mean, once again, it's a big question to both of you, but I mean, do you think that there is a segment of particularly that kind of historical building stock that we have that is just not possible to be retrofitted? I mean, from a residential perspective, you know, I sit in a 1905 Edwardian brick-built semi-detached, and it is what it is. You know, there's no, it's just bricks between me and the outside world, and it's been double glazed and the roof insulated, etc. But there comes a point where you think that there are probably limits to what we can do with historic buildings. Is that the case, do you think?
Yeah, I do honestly believe that is the case, Andrew. My house is 1883 and I've got a super efficient gas boiler. I've got lots of PV, I've got batteries. I'm getting external wall insulation around my bay windows, which are an additional bit. But the rest of it's B rated, it's B listed, so I can't do anything to the rest of it. The solum under the floorboards, can't get insulation under there. I've got about 375 mil of insulation in my loft. I've replaced all the windows with super efficient double glazing, but that's it. But I can take a district heating system. If there was a district heating system in my neighbourhood, I could plug into that. That would help decarbonise the grid without affecting the fabric of the building.
I guess that's an important point, isn't it? That there's a danger that we get focused on asset by asset rather than thinking actually on that kind of local level. There may be a way. I was in Bristol yesterday and they were talking about a significant water source heat pump that's doing that regional, that local neighborhood heating. And I think it's maybe a way of looking at localities where you can have perhaps a slightly different approach, where you'll reach the limits of what you can do to the fabric, but there may be other ways of delivering heat that are green and efficient, which have to be laid against that sort of, perhaps dare I say, obsession with fabric first, where you do run out of an ability to fix the fabric.
Well, that is the truth. Whether it's domestic or commercial, there are only two things you can do: is make the fabric more efficient or generate your own energy. Use less and use green. And if the more green electrons that flow into your building, the better. Well, the fewer green electrons flowing, but they've got to be green.
Yeah, indeed. Lisa, going to you, I'd be interested to know, given the work you've done historically, clearly you've got lots of historic data on the residential side, but I'm guessing you're probably seeing some fairly horrendous heat loss from commercial properties when you start to look at them.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, mainly in things like supermarkets, retail units. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that. And I mean, the feedback, because obviously the client we work with there is like your property consultants. So we can carry out the survey, we can highlight all the areas of heat loss, and we can quantify that as well. But it will sit on a desk after that. And I think that's the bit I find kind of confusing. It's like, I think there's a lot of organisations like, what do we do with this? How much is it going to cost? Again, is what Stewart said. It's all about how much is this going to cost? Will we just wait? Will we just deal with the higher energy costs because it's just too much of a headache to think about retrofitting this building? Or should we move, if it's like an office? So we've had a lot of that, companies saying, this company's thinking about moving office and we want to just assess what the condition of that building is. Can we retrofit it? How far can we retrofit it? And what would be the effect on their energy costs of that? Or, versus we move to a more efficient building that's maybe newer. I have seen a few people doing that.
Yeah. The tricky bit as well, just to add to that, Lisa, is I think the statistic is something like 85% of commercial property is rented. And if you're in a rented office block, the chances of you being allowed to do anything to the fabric are minimal. And the landlord doesn't make any savings from the measures. So the chances of him paying for it are very, very slim. Because there is no return on investment for him unless the asset is worth more money. And the only way it's worth more money is if you can put the rent up. So there has to be this systemic thing where a retrofitted building is worth more than a not retrofitted building. And I think that is the case. I mean, that client just literally last week was telling me that £10 to £15 difference per square foot between an inefficient building and an efficient building. And I think the cost of energy crisis, if anything good has come of that, it's the raising of awareness of the operational costs of a commercial building. I mean, we've had councils that can't afford to open swimming pools, schools close down swimming pools, community centres shut because they can't afford their energy bill. That's crazy, but it's reality. So it's a good driver though for change.
I mean, in terms of drivers to change, I suppose staying with you, Stewart, initially, we've talked about this kind of the debate or the tension between kind of new build or demolition. But I suppose in a similar way, and I suppose this is linked to some of the kind of other, changes we've seen post-pandemic, is that kind of commercial to resi conversion, or indeed, if we have a shopping centre that's no longer viable, not just from an energy perspective, but perhaps from a kind of a economic perspective, are you seeing people looking in an innovative way at these kind of conversions of existing buildings to say, well, actually, maybe the retrofit happens at the same time as a significant conversion in change of use to take it from office to residential if it's a suitable floor plate?
Yeah, we have a client who's actually buying up shopping centres and turning them into offices and then putting flats and restaurants in the shopping centre. So the staff, and it's mainly big Chinese computer programming companies that are its clients, but they're basically taking up a big space for computer programmers to sit and do their work, but they also live in the shopping centre. And on the way from the office to their flat, they're spending their money in the restaurants that he also owns. But the key driver for him is ESG. He's putting things like beehives on the roof,
yeah,
because you get certain credits for that. You know, but it's everything. It's that holistic view. But that taking carbon out of the whole, how do my staff get to work? How much is parking? That's a benefit to the staff. Now, whether you'd want to live and work in a shopping centre, Andrew, it's not for me. But
as long as it was warm. If it was warm, you'd be fine. Probably warmer than my house.
I mean, Lisa, I mean, on this kind of theme, I touched on it slightly earlier about the kind of changes we've seen from the pandemic, and obviously, you know, it's become a cliche now to talk about hybrid working from home, and the changing use of commercial buildings. And obviously, even pre-pandemic, we've had the rise of e-commerce and the challenge that's presented to retail. I mean, how are you seeing that playing out in terms of almost a dual challenge now? Because arguably asset owners are ending up with buildings that are potentially not performing very well from an energy and a retrofit perspective, so that when they do come to a lease break or a new occupier, they probably do want to spend some money to retrofit it to get market rent. And then at the same time, you've got people from the occupier side thinking, well, we've got too much space now, and we're using it in a different way, and I'm paying energy bills for a building that's only full half the time. And how are you seeing that playing out from the kind of people you're working with?
Well, I mean, the feedback I'm getting from clients at the moment is that people are assessing how much space they need, and a lot of things have changed now that there's the hybrid working, and you know, a third of your staff could be in the office for maybe just 2.5 days a week. So I have seen a lot of presentations based around that, and maybe that's why they're not too quick to retrofit. I think they're testing things out, like, you know, tweaking their BMS systems, their control systems, their heating controls, zonal heating as well, so they're not heating the full building all the time. Monitoring behaviour, educating staff, smart lighting, smart heating, smart, you know, everything's connected. There is a lot of testing going on in that area, and I think it's wise to do that, but you would need to probably do that over a couple of heating seasons, and then, you know, maybe that's the delay in the commercial side of things on retrofit. Maybe they are still assessing how much space do we need, and how much would it actually cost us if our staff started to, you know, switching off their computers and switching the lights off at night. How much would we save with that? Nice, easy measures to deal with to start with.
And I suppose, indeed, this does also come into play with in my view, another kind of issue around retrofit is making buildings smarter, because actually it's not just fabric and heating systems, it's the kind of smart infrastructure around that to help you optimize those moving forward. Because as we know, you can have a building with a tremendous, you know, rating in one of the various rating systems that if it's not operated well, will still not operate and give you great performance. So it's that ongoing ability to have a smarter building. And I guess that's once again a huge challenge with such a long tail of buildings that one could rather rudely describe as being dumb rather than smart, in terms of the ability to monitor the HVAC, or indeed understand how many people are in it on a given day. I suppose the last thing I'd like to kind of pose as an issue to both of you is, and I suppose it comes back to that fundamental theme about commercial real estate being income generating and thus money being such a driver, that I suppose the other challenge is that some people may view energy use as being a relatively small proportion of the overall cost of running a building, and does that mean it's still not going up the agenda high enough?
That's a good question.
Ladies first.
I think there's two different priorities. There's ticking the box for ESG, that for larger organisations, definitely. There's also, I mean, you can add into the mix on top of energy costs, the healthy building side of it as well. So, you know, the damp and mold issues, you know, people shutting down their heating systems, that type of thing. So there's there's probably three focuses there for most of these organisations, and one is ticking the box for ESG, getting their energy costs down, and providing a healthy environment if it is an office block or a shop or, you know, a supermarket type thing. So I don't think I've actually answered that question for you, Andrew. I think that is the problem in the sector. It's quite hard for them to make decisions on a large building that's going to cost a lot of money because there's so many factors to take into consideration. And even just thinking about reporting back on embodied carbon, that's a minefield at the moment as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, it's a non-answer.
There's also the big problem that when MEES or MEPS, however you want to call it, when that legislation was first announced, I came down to London. You can probably tell by Lisa and I's accents we're north of Hadrian's Wall. But I came down to London, I met a bunch of building surveyors, all separately, and one said, we're taking MEPS really seriously. We're a professional organisation. We need to give our clients good, solid, data-driven advice. And 300 yards up the road, another massive big RICS surveyor said, we don't think the legislation will happen. It will be diluted. Brexit will happen. This is a while ago. Brexit will happen. We'll pull out of it. The landscape will change. The funding will change. So we're not interested in it at all. Our advice to our clients is just do things that make solid business sense. So give me a business case that makes sense and everything else will flow. And it was that client that gave us work. The first client was a non-client. Although he said all the right things, physically doing it, the chap that went pragmatically, he was the one that gave us business. But when I sat with a chap called Neil Plennell at Land Securities in Trafalgar Square, I sat with him and he said, look at this shopping mall we own. We've got a situation where next their lease ends in 12 months and we're telling them under MEES they have to spend X amount of money to bring that building up to code so they can move out, so a new tenant can move in, because they can't rent it and let the new person in unless the outgoing one spends money. And the outgoing one doesn't want to spend any money because part of it was you had to help improve the communal areas. That was part of the obligation.
Yeah.
Multiply that by 200 shops in that shopping centre, all with leases that end at different times. That's a nightmare, absolute nightmare. And the guy that's spending all the money to leave doesn't benefit from any of the savings.
No, it is, and I suppose in conclusion, it is about the irony that we probably have a lot of the technology now that we need, and we're increasingly getting the data and the analytics, as you said, Lisa, in terms of turning that raw data into analytics. But the challenge still remains making the business case, doesn't it? Making the numbers add up, where, yes, from an altruistic point of view, it's the right thing to do, but we have to be realistic that occupiers and asset owners need to see a business case step by step to start this journey. And it is going to take time because it's going to be both for both sectors a long journey, but it's got to be a business case that makes sense, hasn't it?
What we are seeing as well, Andrew, is that the pension funds are heavily pushing this agenda. They want big, long, solid, safe, steady returns for hundreds of years. If they can keep pushing the ESG agenda, that's a good thing, because that will cascade and trickle down to every single building in the country. Honestly, money is the answer to most questions. It's sad, but it's true.
No, as you say that capital market is driving it, because as you say, it's now that the money flows in. Once again, commercial real estate needs funding to be built and maintained, and therefore, the piper calls the tune, and that will hopefully be a good thing in this sense of driving that kind of behaviour. Well, Stuart, Lisa, thanks ever so much for your time again. It's been a fascinating conversation, and perhaps, as you said, Lisa, perhaps we haven't answered every question, but I think we've certainly brought the issues to light and debated them in a great way. So thanks again for the time, for both of you.
No problem, thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thanks, Lisa.
Pleasure.